Hello, my name is Josephine Baird. I'm a lecturer at Uppsala University Department of Game Design, and this is a short lecture on playtesting. So, what is it and why do we use it? Well, in short, it's in order to determine if a game as a whole or a specific element thereof functions as intended, or if there are unusual or unexpected effects. It can be used in order to research the impact or outcome of a particular game design or element, and it can be an integral part of the process of game design itself, for example, through iterative game design, or part of the research process itself, for example, through research through design. If you're interested in research through design, you can look at another lecture in this series. So, what should we consider when we are constructing our playtest or putting it in practice? Well, perhaps the most basic, number one, is to determine the purpose of the playtest. Which aspect of your game design are you testing, or is it the game as a whole? What impact or experience are you interested in measuring? Sounds perhaps obvious, or perhaps not, because often when playtesting is considered, it may be considered just in terms of what does the game feel like? Is it good? Is it bad? These are useful questions, but not necessarily particular, and they may not actually give you any information on what you would do with the results of that test. So thinking about exactly what it is that you're interested in testing is, I would say, critical to this process, and then designing a particular methodology to analyze that. What method of data collection would be most useful in accessing the particular information you're interested in related to the specific goal of your playtest? Could it be a quantitative or qualitative form of data collection? That will depend a little bit on the information that you're looking for. And in that case, would you use surveys or questionnaires or interviews? These are common to look at player experience, for example. If you're interested in what the players are experiencing internally when they're engaging with your game, these are some of the most common methods. But of course, they're not the only ones. You could use observational methods and any other kinds of methods that might get you to the information that you're looking for. Consider what is the most useful method to collect the most relevant data. And then, of course, interrogate that method as well. Consider what are the advantages and disadvantages of each approach, and why choose one methodology over the other. Consider the potential drawbacks, consider the potential strengths of a particular methodology, and consider the impact that methodology may have on the data that you're collecting. If you're interested in this more, have a look at the lecture on surveys, questionnaires, and consent. And then consider the players who you will invite to the test. Does your test require specific players who have particular experience or backgrounds? Not all players are the same. I know that may be obvious, but this is something that is intuitively sort of believed when a lot of playtests are done, especially in environments where these things are not reflected upon. The presumption is that your game may be experienced one way by all players. This is not the case. Many different kinds of play is engaged with by many different people from different experience, different interests, and different backgrounds. And as such, you could also consider whether or not that difference in experience or background is actually something that you want to examine in your playtest. How would you recruit playtesters from specific backgrounds or differing backgrounds? And does your method of recruitment have an impact on your test? For example, if you have a large body of people who you can access through randomized recruitment, that might have an impact on your test. Or if you're a smaller group who are doing a more of a sample of convenience, which basically means you're getting testers that you know or know of that you can get because it's a convenience sample. There are people that you can access sort of like through convenient methods. They're likely to be people who have connections in some way. Does that have an impact on the test, on the data that you're going to be able to get from that test? Neither of which is a problem. It just needs to be accounted for and to be considered. How can you ensure the safer experience of your playtesters? And how can you pseudo-anonymize the data that you're collecting from your playtesters? This is about the ethics of the data that you're collecting. Consider how you can make your test minimize the potential negative impact of that test. If you're interested in more about this, we go over it in another lecture, the surveys, interviews, and consent lecture. But in short, It's about making sure that the potential impact of your test does not have an adverse effect on those people who have been kind enough to test the game for you. This is particularly important if your game is dealing with, say, sensitive topics, and pseudo-anonymizing the data is a way to make sure that if you are using playtesters' information, you are not sharing it in such a way that those playtesters can be identified. But again, have a look at that other lecture if you're interested. Number 4, how will you analyze the data from your test? What analytical lens is most appropriate, not only to the form of data collection itself, but the goals of the playtest? Your method of analyzing the data will depend on those two things. And it'll be important to consider prior to the test because it'll be useful to be able to apply it relevantly afterwards, once you have your data. Consider how and who conducts that analysis and how are the results recorded and documented. This is, of course, critical. Recording and documenting your results is an absolutely critical part of playtesting. It seems obvious, perhaps, but it can sometimes be lost. That data needs to be documented, recorded, and disseminated in a way that is useful to those people who are going to read it, those people who are going to need it, to use it, to iterate on the design process. Finally, what conclusions and iterations can you draw from that data analysis, and how would that inform your further process of design? Say, for example, if your playtest confirms earlier hypotheses and or intentions, what implications does that have for your current or future design? How would you implement what you learned from the positive, potentially, effect of your playtest? What would you do to build on that? And how would you then test it again to see if those things have been borne out in your future design? If your playtest disconfirms earlier hypotheses or intentions, or indeed brings up something that was unexpected, how might you implement that into current or future designs? How would you iterate on the process using the results of your playtest? Thinking about that prior to your playtesting will give you an insight into what goals you might be looking for with your playtest, but also think about the methods of data collection and, of course, analysis. Having that in mind when you start can be really, really useful to the design of the playtest itself. And that is also something that you consider after your test. What tests would you need to conduct on your iteration to determine if alterations that you've made have been successful? And how can you indeed consider iterating on the playtest procedure itself? Did the playtest work? Did the playtest work to get your information that you wanted, to consider the goals that you needed to provide the analysis that you were looking for? You can iterate on the playtest procedure itself as well as the design, and those things are worth considering. Playtesting can be an integral aspect of the design and research process. Playtesting is often conducted at the end or conclusion of a particular design endeavor, especially in commercial markets. One can think of quality assurance, for example. That kind of testing can be very useful, but it doesn't allow for issues to be noticed, resolved, considered during the process. And I believe that playtesting can be an integral part of the design process itself, with testing being conducted throughout the design to check and see what impact elements of the game is having, or if there are changes by when you've made an alteration in your design, does that have a different impact? It can also form a part of the iterative game design process, which is a specific methodology to game designing. This is in the sense where you continually do tests and iterate specifically on the results of that design, and you keep making changes throughout the design process. But of course, it can also be an integral part of game design research, including through research through design. As I've mentioned, there is another lecture specifically on that in this series. But in short, it's an approach to game design in which research tests whether theoretical principles actually bear out in games design by doing it practically, literally designing a game based on theoretical principles. Ideas that you believe might have a certain impact can be researched by practically creating them, seeing what happens, testing it, and then iterating upon that, and then drawing conclusions from that as part of a research project. The advantages of regular playtesting then through design is that you can receive pertinent test data on your designs, and that can inform future design approaches and decisions. It means you can test design intentions, approaches, and desired impacts of your particular game elements as they're introduced in your process. And of course, it allows for iterative game design in itself, and of course, research through design. But there are some considerations. Successful playtesting, for example, of a specific element during your design process may not be replicated when those elements are introduced into a fuller game design. Just because it works if you isolate a particular mechanic or process doesn't mean that that impact will continue to happen if you introduce it into a larger game design, or, for example, if you iterate upon that, even if you're using the same principle. That is why continued playtesting is really useful. Remember, the background and experience of your testers will have an impact on the data collected. That is to be acknowledged and considered. It doesn't necessarily need to be seen as a problem. And of course, ethical consideration on the playtest experience and data pseudo-anonymization must be included, and that is critical. So in conclusion, playtesting is often a useful element to incorporate and consider as an integral part of any design process. Testing itself must be carefully designed in order to collect relevant data and allow for relevant analysis. And conclusions drawn from playtesting can provide the basis for future design decisions, as well as be an aspect of iterative design and research. And always, careful consideration of the ethical impact of the playtesting and data must be included. Thank you for listening. I hope this has been useful.